What follows is not a legend, it is a record. That record has been examined, challenged, and revisited for decades, and despite that, it does not resolve. In November 1971, authorities at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport received an urgent communication from Northwest Orient Flight 305. The Boeing 727, which had departed Portland just 30 minutes earlier, reported an unusual situation unfolding in its rear cabin. A passenger had handed a note to a flight attendant claiming to have a bomb. But when the aircraft finally landed in Seattle and FBI agents began their investigation, they didn't find a terrorist or a political extremist seeking international headlines. Instead, they found a man in a business suit who had made specific demands: exactly $200,000, 4 parachutes, and a flight plan that seemed unusual for a hijacking. And the person responsible had done something investigators later found unexpected. He appeared calm. He gave detailed instructions, and he displayed knowledge about aircraft systems that seemed beyond what most passengers would know. But what investigators discovered later, when the aircraft landed in Reno with its rear stairs still deployed and its cabin empty, raised questions that would never be fully answered. The man had jumped into the night sky over the Pacific Northwest wilderness. And despite one of the most extensive manhunts in FBI history, no one has ever definitively discovered what happened to him, who he was, or whether he survived. The person at the center of this story gave his name as Dan Cooper, though a reporter's error would soon immortalize him as D.B. Cooper. Witnesses described him as a man in his mid-40s wearing a dark business suit, white shirt, narrow black tie, and carrying a black attaché case, the appearance of an ordinary businessman traveling on Thanksgiving Eve. People who encountered him that day described him as unremarkable, polite, even courteous. Flight attendant Florence Schaffner initially assumed his note was a lonely traveler's phone number. The ticket agent who sold him his one-way ticket to Seattle noticed nothing unusual about the man who paid cash. But there was one thing about Dan Cooper that almost no one realized until it was far too late. He possessed knowledge about the Boeing 727's capabilities that investigators would later find surprising. Information about aircraft systems that wasn't typically available to the public. He moved through the hijacking with what appeared to be unusual composure, making specific technical demands that suggested familiarity with aviation procedures. And whether through planning or circumstance, he had positioned himself to attempt something that aviation experts would later consider extremely dangerous. Meanwhile, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 was preparing for a routine 30-minute hop from Portland to Seattle on the afternoon of November 24, 1971. It was Thanksgiving Eve, and the aircraft carried only 36 passengers, far fewer than its capacity. The crew of 6 included Captain William Scott, First Officer William Ratajczak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and flight attendants Alice Hancock, Tina Mucklow, and Florence Schaffner. Around 2:50 p.m. PST, the man calling himself Dan Cooper approached the Northwest Orient counter at Portland International Airport. He purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle using cash, providing the name that would echo through decades of speculation and investigation. He boarded the aircraft carrying his attaché case and what witnesses described as a brown paper bag, approximately 4 inches tall. On the surface, it looked like an unremarkable business trip on a holiday afternoon, one of thousands of similar flights that day across the country. Cooper took his seat in the last row of the aircraft, position 18E, and settled in for the short flight. Shortly after takeoff, he ordered a bourbon and 7-Up from flight attendant Schaffner, who was seated in the jump seat directly behind him. He appeared relaxed, unhurried. And it was during those first minutes after takeoff when Cooper handed Schaffner a handwritten note and leaned forward to whisper a quiet warning that the situation changed. No one aboard the aircraft understood what was unfolding, or that the events on Flight 305 would remain unresolved more than 50 years later. When Cooper handed the note to Florence Schaffner, she assumed it was exactly what dozens of flight attendants encountered weekly: a passenger's phone number, perhaps an awkward attempt at flirtation. She tucked it into her purse without reading it and continued her duties. But then, Cooper leaned close and spoke quietly but clearly. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner opened the note. Written in neat, all-capital letters with a felt-tip pen, The message was direct. "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase and want you to sit by me." When she complied and quietly asked to see the bomb, Cooper opened his attaché case. Inside were 2 rows of 4 red cylinders that appeared to be dynamite, connected by wires to what looked like a large cylindrical battery. Whether it was a real explosive device or an elaborate fake, Schaffner couldn't determine, but it looked convincing enough. Cooper then outlined his demands. Schaffner wrote everything down and brought it to the cockpit, informing Captain Scott of the situation. The demands were specific: $200,000 in negotiable American currency in a knapsack, delivered by 5 p.m., 2 front parachutes, 2 back parachutes. For a moment, the crew considered their options: alert the passengers, attempt to overpower him, refuse his demands. But investigators would later note several factors that complicated any direct action. By requesting 2 sets of parachutes, both main and reserve, Cooper implied he might take a hostage with him. That possibility discouraged authorities from providing sabotaged equipment. His seat selection in the rear of the cabin gave him a view of everyone in front of him. And the bomb, real or not, represented a threat at 10,000 feet. Captain Scott made the decision to comply fully, informing Northwest Orient's operations in Minnesota of the situation. The aircraft entered a holding pattern over Puget Sound, circling for nearly 2 hours, while authorities assembled the ransom money and parachutes. And that's when crew members began noticing something that would later feature prominently in FBI analysis: Cooper's apparent familiarity with certain details that seemed unusual for a typical passenger. As Flight 305 continued its slow circles over Seattle, flight attendant Tina Mucklow took over as Cooper's primary liaison, sitting beside him while Schaffner remained in the cockpit to document events. And it was during this extended period of waiting that crew members noticed details about Cooper's behavior that would later be analyzed extensively by investigators. When the aircraft flew over Tacoma, Cooper looked out the window and remarked, "Looks like Tacoma down there." When told the parachutes were coming from McChord Air Force Base, he noted that McChord was only a 20-minute drive from SeaTac Airport, geographic knowledge that seemed more specific than most passengers would possess. Mucklow would later describe Cooper's demeanor as remarkably composed. He wasn't visibly nervous or agitated. He asked her polite questions about where she was from, offered her a cigarette, even laughed when she asked why he'd chosen Northwest Orient Airlines. "It's not because I have a grudge against your airlines," he said. "It's just because I have a grudge." But when Mucklow asked where he was from, Cooper's mood shifted. He became upset and refused to answer. At 5:24 p.m., Captain Scott informed Cooper they were ready to land. The parachutes and money had been assembled. At 5:46 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at SeaTac Airport, parking on a partially lit runway away from the main terminal, as Cooper had directed. Cooper had successfully extracted a ransom and obtained the parachutes. Authorities had paid the money and now waited to see what Cooper would do next. Then Cooper issued his next set of instructions, and they revealed knowledge about aviation that FBI agents would later find significant. He wanted the aircraft refueled and flown to Mexico City at minimum airspeed at 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down, wing flaps at 15 degrees, and the cabin unpressurized. These weren't random specifications. Investigators would later determine they created the conditions for a highly risky maneuver. And that's when investigators began forming theories about what Cooper was attempting. Investigators later concluded that Cooper had not hijacked Flight 305 for the ransom money alone, despite demanding $200,000. The specific aircraft chosen, the unusual flight parameters, all of it suggested something that aviation experts would later debate extensively. The working theory became that Cooper had intended from the beginning to attempt something that many experts considered highly dangerous: parachuting from the rear of a Boeing 727 in flight at night, over the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, carrying the ransom money with him. An FBI analysis would later suggest Cooper possessed knowledge about the Boeing 727 that was not commonly known. The aircraft had a feature that commercial pilots weren't routinely taught about. Its rear air stair could be lowered during flight, and once activated from the cabin, the operation couldn't be overridden from the cockpit. This capability was reportedly being used for covert operations during the Vietnam War, though this wasn't information provided in civilian aviation training. How Cooper knew about this feature became a central question in the investigation. After the passengers were released in Seattle and the aircraft was refueled, Cooper ordered the crew to take off for Mexico City. When safety concerns were raised about taking off with the rear air stair deployed, he responded, "It can be done, do it." He then agreed to lower it himself once airborne. The only person he required to remain aboard, besides the flight crew, was Tina Mucklow, until he was ready to proceed with whatever he had planned. Around 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 took off from Seattle with only 5 people aboard: Cooper, Mucklow, and the 3 flight crew members. 2 F-106 fighters and a T-33 trainer followed at a distance, flying S-patterns to stay behind the slow-moving 727. Cooper instructed Mucklow to go to the cockpit, close the curtain partition between first class and coach, and not return. Before she left, she saw him standing in the aisle tying what appeared to be the money bag around his waist. That was the last time anyone saw D.B. Cooper. At approximately 8 p.m., a warning light indicated the rear air stair had been deployed. At 8:13 p.m., the aircraft's tail section suddenly pitched upward, consistent with weight being released from the rear of the plane. The crew used the intercom to ask if Cooper needed assistance, but received no reply. When Flight 305 landed in Reno at 11:02 p.m., the rear air stair was still down. FBI agents surrounded the aircraft cautiously, but when they finally searched the cabin, they found something that would launch one of the longest unsolved cases in FBI history. Cooper was gone. The money was gone. 2 of the 4 parachutes were gone. And somewhere over the wilderness of southwest Washington, a man had apparently exited the aircraft, carrying the ransom money. But there was something else investigators would discover only gradually, something that would complicate their understanding of what had occurred. When the aircraft was empty and the bomb threat had been cleared, investigators began processing the scene. This wasn't just a hijacking, it was a case that would prove difficult to resolve. Police and FBI agents recovered physical evidence from the aircraft: Cooper's black clip-on tie and mother-of-pearl tie clip, 8 Raleigh cigarette butts from the armrest ashtray, and a single strand of hair from his headrest. They found 66 latent fingerprints throughout the cabin. 2 parachutes remained aboard, 1 reserved chute that had been opened with 3 shroud lines cut away, and 1 intact main parachute. When confronted with witness descriptions, FBI sketch artists developed composite drawings of Cooper. Flight attendants Schaffner and Mucklow, who spent the most time with him, described a man in his mid-40s, approximately 5'10" to 6 feet tall, 170 to 180 pounds, with olive-toned skin, brown eyes, and dark hair combed back. No discernible accent. Athletic build despite his age. Authorities immediately began questioning possible suspects and attempting to reconstruct Cooper's likely landing zone. But precisely defining the search area proved difficult. The variables were numerous: wind speed and direction at different altitudes, Cooper's weight including the money and parachute, how long he remained in freefall before deploying his chute, the cloud cover that prevented visual confirmation. The F-106 pilots never saw anyone jump. Their radar never detected a deployed parachute. Visual confirmation was nearly impossible given the conditions. Initial calculations placed Cooper's landing zone somewhere south of Mount St. Helens, possibly near Lake Merwin or the Lewis River. FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, and National Guard units conducted extensive ground searches. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the dense forest. Door-to-door searches were conducted at rural farmhouses. Patrol boats ran along the lakes and rivers. Nothing was found. No parachute, no body, no ransom money, no trace of Cooper or his equipment. In December 1971, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover authorized the use of an SR-71 Blackbird reconnaissance aircraft to photograph Flight 305's entire flight path. The spy plane made 5 passes, but poor visibility rendered the photographs inconclusive. In spring 1972, over 200 soldiers from Fort Lewis joined FBI agents in another search operation. 18 days in March, another 18 in April. A submarine searched the depths of Lake Merwin. Electronic equipment scanned the terrain. They found nothing related to Cooper. The FBI distributed lists of the ransom money's serial numbers to financial institutions worldwide. Northwest Orient offered a reward. In 1972, Attorney General John Mitchell released the serial numbers to the general public. Newspapers offered their own rewards. Not a single verified bill surfaced. Not one. For 8 years, D.B. Cooper's fate remained undetermined. The case seemed unlikely to be resolved. Still, one detail troubled investigators. The specific flight parameters Cooper demanded, the knowledge he displayed about the aircraft, the parachutes he selected, all suggested someone with particular expertise, someone who understood what they were attempting. So why hadn't a single dollar of that money appeared? Why no trace of equipment? Why no information from anyone who might have helped him? The questions remained unanswered. Years later, when investigators reviewed the case files, overlooked evidence began suggesting possibilities no one had initially considered. On February 10, 1980, more than 8 years after Cooper jumped, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand along the Columbia River at Tina Bar, about 20 miles southwest of Cooper's suspected drop zone. He was building a campfire when his rake uncovered 3 packets of badly deteriorated $20 bills, still bound in rubber bands. FBI technicians confirmed these were Cooper bills, $5,800 in total, in the exact sequential order they'd been given to Cooper. The discovery generated renewed public interest. It also created new questions. How did the money get there? The bills were found upstream from where Cooper likely jumped, not downstream. They were buried in sand layers that geological evidence suggested were deposited after 1971, possibly not until 1974 or later, after an Army Corps of Engineers dredging operation. Only 10 bills were missing from one packet, yet the 3 packets remained together. The evidence seemed inconsistent. If the money had been floating freely in the river for years, the rubber bands would likely have deteriorated before 1980. Yet, they remained intact. In 2020, analysis of diatoms, microscopic algae, found on the bills revealed something unexpected. The diatom species present only bloomed in springtime, indicating the bills arrived at Tina Bar at least several months after the hijacking, possibly years later. This evidence suggested the money hadn't entered the water during Cooper's jump in November 1971. When or how it arrived at Tina Bar remained unexplained. But further examination of evidence Cooper left on the aircraft revealed additional details. In 2009, a team of scientists using electron microscopy examined Cooper's tie and found unusual particles, unalloyed titanium, rare earth elements like cerium, strontium sulfide, bismuth, and antimony alloys. During the 1970s, pure titanium was uncommon and specialized, used primarily in certain aircraft fabrication facilities or in chemical plants storing highly corrosive materials. The FBI theorized this might indicate Cooper had worked in aerospace or chemical manufacturing, possibly on specialized projects. Whether this was accurate remained speculative. The agency had suspected Cooper might have military experience, possibly Air Force background, but definitive conclusions about his identity or background were never established. In 1978, 7 years after the hijacking, a deer hunter found a placard with instructions for lowering the aft air stair about 13 miles east of Castle Rock, Washington, within Flight 305's flight path. Just a placard, no other items were recovered nearby. And in 2019, the FBI released a previously overlooked report about a grocery store burglary near Hyson, Washington, within the calculated drop zone that occurred approximately 3 hours after Cooper jumped. The burglar took only certain items, beef jerky, gloves, items that might be useful for survival. But the burglar wore military-style boots with corrugated soles. Witnesses had described Cooper wearing slip-on loafers. Whether this incident was connected to the hijacking was never determined. The evidence created competing interpretations. Some suggested Cooper died during or shortly after the jump. The conditions were poor: stormy weather, darkness, challenging terrain. He jumped at approximately 200 miles per hour without proper protective equipment. Many investigators believed survival was unlikely, but other evidence suggested alternative possibilities. Multiple copycat hijackers survived similar jumps in comparable or worse conditions. Richard McCoy jumped from a 727 and landed safely. Frederick Hahnemann parachuted into a Honduran jungle at night and survived. Martin McNally jumped at twice Flight 305's airspeed without proper equipment and sustained only minor injuries. In 2008, FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach, who had worked the case for years, stated he had revised his initial assessment of Cooper's chances. Initially certain Cooper had died, Himmelsbach later acknowledged that survival may not have been as improbable as first assumed. The case remains officially unsolved. The FBI suspended active investigation in 2016. The 66-volume case file is preserved, available for review. But the central questions remain unanswered. The case remains unresolved. A man who called himself Dan Cooper boarded a commercial flight on Thanksgiving Eve 1971, hijacked the aircraft, obtained $200,000 in ransom, and jumped into darkness over the Pacific Northwest. He displayed knowledge that suggested familiarity with aviation systems. He made specific technical demands. He appeared composed under circumstances that might have rattled others. And then he disappeared, leaving behind physical evidence that created more questions than answers. The FBI concluded Cooper likely died during the jump. Weather conditions, terrain, and equipment suggested low probability of survival. But the evidence was not definitive. That same evidence indicated Cooper may have had relevant experience. Whether that experience was sufficient for survival could not be determined from available records. Whether D.B. Cooper died in the wilderness or survived, the crime was never solved. No conclusive identification was ever made. No definitive evidence of his fate was recovered. The money found at Tina Bar created additional questions about timeline and location. The diatom evidence suggested deposition months or years after the hijacking. How the bills arrived there remains unexplained. Over 1,000 suspects were investigated over 45 years. Some matched physical descriptions. Some had military or aviation backgrounds. Some confessed. None were conclusively proven to be Cooper. DNA evidence from the tie failed to match tested suspects. Fingerprints produced no matches. The physical evidence indicated possible professional background, but never identity. 3 packets of deteriorated bills. Microscopic particles on a tie, a placard found in the woods. A grocery store burglary report. Witness statements that couldn't be independently verified. The record shows a hijacking occurred. A man jumped. Money was recovered years later upstream from the suspected jump zone. The rest is documentation that doesn't reconcile. If you're interested in carefully researched cases like this one, you can subscribe to the channel. New investigations are released regularly. If you have thoughts about this case, or details that stood out to you, feel free to leave a comment below.